You're listening to Bridge the Gap Season 4, a podcast dedicated to inform, educate, and influence the future of housing and services for seniors. This podcast is powered by supporting partners Propel Insurance, Enquire, LTC REIT, the Bridge Group Construction, and Solinity. Learn more at btgvoice.com.
Welcome to Bridge the Gap Podcast, the senior living podcast with Josh and Lucas in Houston, talking to some of the best thought leaders in the senior living world. We want to welcome Dave Keaton. He's the CEO of RCM out of Houston.
That's right. Yeah. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Very glad that you're here. We have a very relevant topic. We're going to be talking about two things. We're going to be talking about recruiting and retention, and how do we do those things, and specifically, how does Dave do those things? Because recently you were a featured speaker at the TALA conference, and you were talking on empathetic leadership and a variety of different topics. A very close mutual friend of ours, Kimberly, has been on the show as well. And it illustrates something that I see you guys making a pivot in as far as recruiting is concerned. In a market where labor is very, very hard to find, you guys have stepped out of the box and found out some creative ways. Let's discuss.
Sure. Well, we've really been making an effort to recruit hospitality folks. And what I mean by hospitality is people that have been in the hotel industry in particular, restaurant business. What's interesting is this concept of bringing hospitality into senior living actually started quite a few years ago. So even prior to the pandemic, we had a focus on bringing a new skill set in, and people that understood customer service and the true meaning of hospitality. And those folks are trained through school, either through the University of Houston or Texas Tech and other Cornell's another big one that's out there. And those folks, they're trained from the get-go on how do you serve people, how do you create an experience, and that's something that we've been really focused on, is how to create that customer service experience. Customer service has become kind of cliche, I think, over the years, and everybody, you look up on the wall of every store and hotel, and they've got their mission statement, and we're going to take great care of you and all that type of thing. But something that I've really focused in on lately is the idea of the customer experience, meaning from start to finish, not just one particular aspect, in the dining room or at the front desk or with your caregivers and so forth. But what is it like from the time they wake up to the time they go to bed, and how is that whole day gone? And that's where I think the hospitality folks do a really, really great job. So we've been doing that for quite a few years, and then of course the pandemic just opened up the floodgates for us. It was hard actually to attract people from that industry because, young folks coming out of these hospitality programs, they're looking at the big fancy Hiltons and the Marriotts and, the Ritz-Carltons and Four Seasons and so forth. And they're young and they're like, that's where all the parties are and the happening is. And, so it was a real struggle to get folks coming over to senior living. And, so we had to make some concerted efforts and really put together a great sales pitch. As you mentioned, Kimberly's been going with me now to all the different universities, and we're getting ready to head up again to Lubbock here shortly just to talk to their program up there and, try to wow people a little bit. So we put together a really nice, professional video and, show all the high-rise buildings that we operate and others that operate, and try to get folks to go, okay, that's really impressive. So, and again, that pandemic just finally opened the doors for us and said, okay, well now they actually needed a job. So they're like,
sure.
We got quite a few folks. And several of our executive directors now are former hotel general managers. Our VP of hospitality, came from the local Zaza here in the Hilton Post Oak. So it's really nice to have a kind of a nice fresh approach.
So in our industry, for a long time, prior to the pandemic, recruitment, retention, the turnover rate has always been something we've talked about. So the pandemic brought new challenges, particularly on the recruitment front. You guys have done a great job at being unique and targeting hospitality, bringing in some of those folks. But let's transition now. How do you keep them? How do you retain? How do you keep that turnover rate lower? So what are some strategies that you guys are doing to retain your workers that you're getting?
Sure. Well, I think, the most important thing that, again, a lot of people say this, but, communicating with your teams. And so we spent a tremendous amount of time working with all of our communities. We've got about 30 locations that we're working with, and we had 2 scheduled calls, with the teams every week. And luckily, Zoom and Microsoft Teams and all that kind of came together and allowed us to, do video calls. But we got everybody together and said, okay, where's everybody at? What's going on? How are you feeling? How are the teams reacting? Everybody, and that was one of the topics that I mentioned, that you guys mentioned that we talked about at Tala was empathetic leadership. And, the concept of empathetic leadership is always discussed, but it's hard to do because, a lot of people are very sympathetic and they utilize sympathetic management. And that means, hey, I feel for you, okay? But you don't really understand what the pandemic did for us is allowed me and my whole team and everybody else to be an empathetic leader because guess what? We all rode through this together. We were all fearful of what was happening. We all had no idea what was going to be happening next. When the vaccine started to come out initially, I sat there and I said, oh yeah, I'm going to wait 6 months at least. I'm going to watch to see what happens to everybody. And, ultimately, after doing a lot of research and so forth, we, our senior leadership team, Jim Crace, who's our overall CEO, said, hey, let's do this. He was very supportive. I was supportive, and my whole senior team really got behind it. And we filmed a video and showed all of us getting the vaccines. We were the first. As soon as it became available, we were there. And we made a very big point of telling everybody, hey, you know what? We're going to do this. But what it did is allowed us to be empathetic leaders. And again, we could relate to the fears that people had. Is this going to harm me? What's the long-term effects? Should I take it? Should I not take it? And that's all the same things that the staff were feeling. And so we could go back and visit with them and say, you know what, I got the same exact feelings. And I think that's where it helped us because then we would go out to each of the communities and I would talk to all the line staff. And I had some tough meetings. I had some meetings where people were yelling back at me going, what are you doing? Especially when we went towards the mandate because we thought it was important. But, people said, hey, look, you're threatening my job. I don't want to do this. How can you do this to me and my family? And they're yelling and screaming. And we sat there and said, look, and that's where the empathy part came in, which is really helpful for me. It's like I could sit there, I get it. I talked to my own wife and my own kids about this. And, and ultimately I did a lot of research and I've come to the decision that I think it's safe and it's the best thing for us to do. And quite honestly, a lot of folks really came on board with it at that point. So I really do believe in the concept of empathetic leadership. But the point is you got to get from sympathy to empathy, and it's hard to do, and you don't always have that situation. Sometimes people are dealing with cancer, or somebody had a car accident or something like that. I may not have a relationship that way, so it's hard, for myself or any other manager to, I guess I can understand, but until you really live it, it's hard to deal with. I think focusing that way helped us with turnover. We certainly had turnover, just like always, but I think at least just getting out and talking with folks and closing that back door. The recruitment side, clearly front door, Kimberly and the whole recruitment team is working really hard to get people to come work for us, but it doesn't do any good if everybody's just leaving, out the back door just as fast as we're bringing them in. And so I think, again, just talking to folks, we, like a lot of other providers, it wasn't totally unique, but the hero pay, I think, was something that was very, very important. We put together food baskets for teams. We tried to be flexible with, working at home, especially at our, you can't work at home, obviously, as a caregiver too much, but certainly in the corporate office and so forth, we shut down the office, just like a lot of companies did, and allowed people to work from home. Gave them the necessary computers and so forth to be able to do that. And we're still being flexible. We still have people that go, my child's school is, on and off. And so, okay, we're not going to play hardball here. We're going to say, okay, let's see how we can work it out and flex around those schedules and make sure that you can still get the job done. And, luckily with technology and so forth, a lot of things can get done remotely. And so I think having that flexibility has been one of the biggest aspects.
Well, I like the concept and the conversation that you brought up, moving from sympathy to empathy. And while you were mentioning that all of us, I guess the pandemic brought us together in many ways because we all were kind of in it together. Mm-hmm. I do think that brings up a valid point that we've talked a lot about on this show of we each, every single person, all of your large labor force has unique experiences in life mm-hmm. that are able to touch other people uniquely. Yes, I may not have lived through a particular type of cancer, but there's probably someone on your team that can relate to someone else that's joining the team. So I think that culture of empathy, if you foster that as a culture point and as a value, that's going to bring your whole culture tighter together. And I do think that's a huge retention point, because I think people do want to feel like they're part of a family, part of a mission that's moving forward together. So we have this great shift that's happening in our industry from the products and services that we have traditionally provided, the physical plants, but also we're talking now about the labor. So recruitment is changing, the tactics, the retention methodology emphasis is changing. Are there any specific trends that you're seeing? You've been doing this a really long time in the recruitment and hiring people and retaining people. With the new labor force that's coming in, are you seeing any trends in what they're looking for? Like, is there things that are important to them that maybe is different than the workforce of 10, 15 years ago?
Well, they're all getting younger. I think that's because I'm getting older, but I think looking at families in particular, I've got some folks in our corporate office, a lot of young families, and they're having children, and it's something interesting for me because just watching and how to be flexible with that. One thing I do think I notice is that even a lot of the dads, or future dads, are paying a lot more attention and are asking for time too. And that's always been there. I mean, FMLA has been out there, and you could always take time off, but you really didn't see that very often. A lot of times, moms were burdened with raising the kids and then coming back and getting back into the career and workforce. But a lot of times the dads, they take a day off or two, and that's what I kind of did. I remember my son was born, and I was an ED at the time, and I left the hospital because I got a phone call and, fell asleep at the traffic light. I mean, just flat out. I mean, it wasn't just, you kind of nod off. I mean, I was sleeping because we'd been up all night. But, so I am seeing that now, that there's this need for, work-life balance. And again, I know that's thrown around a lot out there, but I think it's true. I mean, I think people are looking for that. And that's something that we're trying to at least pay attention to. There's still a job to do, and we need people to work hard. But if I can be flexible somewhere, fine. Take a few days off, if you need to, if we've got some time to do it. Yeah, I may ask you to work, till midnight for a week. But in between that, I try to be flexible. And I think the company as a whole, we really work on that is, we understand family. When Harvey, hit Houston, we had a lot of staff that were very, very impacted and, lost everything. And the company stepped up and did some, fairly large, cash donations to these families because they, lost their homes. And so I think that's something that Jim Gray and myself really focus on is, how do we take care of those staff and make them family? That's why we want to stay a fairly small organization. We don't want to get into larger than maybe 50 communities because then you don't know who works for you anymore. You become more a little bit of a real estate transaction, when you're, in the 200-300 plus building range, there's no way for a corporate team to know everybody. Now, I don't know every 1,800 employees, but, I know certainly a good number of them, and, people know me, and I think it's important as you're going to the communities to have that relationship.
Yeah, well, one of the things I'm hearing kind of the undertones of when you're talking about the work-life balance, as you mentioned it, is just flexibility. I think people are looking for flexibility with their employers, with their homes, more than ever. Even, I don't consider myself that old, but I mean, even when I was young in the workforce, there wasn't as many mom and dads both working. There was a lot more one or the other staying at home, and now you're seeing everybody pretty taxed,
Sure.
And everybody's looking for flexibilities and schedules. I know we're opening a community now, and that's you touched on one of the number one things is they want to work and they want to be all in when they're there, but sometimes the 12-hour shift is not right for everybody. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the 8-hour shift is not right, and they'd rather have 12. And then we're even seeing sometimes they're like, I really need a consistent 4 or 6-hour shift. Traditionally, I would have said, no, you've got to fit into this.
Right.
And it's like, man, you've got to really learn to, in many ways, going back to your original thing, be empathetic of what people are going through, the demands of their life. And really, when you really boil it down to it, I think most of the time, as long as we get the hours covered, why can't we be a little bit more flexible? And so we've been doing that as well. So I think that's a valid point. Lucas, you get to work with a lot of different operators because being involved in renovations, is this something even in your line of work with working with contractors you're seeing as well?
Not with contractors who just work 24 hours a day. Okay, 2 shifts, 12 hours. No, but I think one of the things and a theme that continues to come up, harkening back to a point you made, is I think that there's this power in regional operations that has always been talked about, but never really fully realized until after this big shift through COVID. It seems to be that the big 500, 1,000 communities nationwide becomes a bit of a challenge. And so we've been at this in Houston, been talking to a lot of regional players and the power in that. What are you seeing as far as a shift in some of these larger portfolios, either with REITs or private equity? And I'm not sure, maybe you guys own or operate some as well.
We do both.
Okay, you do both. So you have experience in both. So what are you seeing there? Like if you're going up against an operator that has 300 communities, 400 communities, 500 communities, do you feel like now more than ever you have the upper hand?
Certainly, and there's been a lot of articles written about this, and you see it all the time. But I think what the investment community is looking for is experts in a particular region. And I think when you get real large, you're kind of trying to meet the needs of nationally, and so you may not know your market as well. You may not know market from both from residents and from staffing, and just what are the dynamics? So for us, we're primarily based here in Houston, and so we know Houston very, very well. The majority of our folks are here. Our teams live here. Our corporate team lives here, and so we know what people are looking for. The difference between being north of 59 and south of 59, or in the loop or out of the loop. And every region has that. Every city has some sort of geographic definition. And
Houston is unique.
Yeah. I mean, so the regional providers know that kind of thing, and it's difficult for somebody that's sitting in a corporate office that's got that national presence to say, oh yeah, well, okay, if you cross this particular street, all of a sudden that's not the market that we're looking for. I mean, for example, our River Oaks and our Southampton communities, basically you can see the communities from the top of each building, but a completely different group of folks, from, the folks obviously in the Southampton area are part of Rice Village and the Med Center, and so you have a lot of physicians and medical staff and researchers and so forth that are down there, and then you go to River Oaks and that's all your oil and gas folks, and they don't want to cross that barrier. So I think that's where the regional really comes in handy, is that your markets, again, from staffing as well as your residents, and also you can get in your buildings. I mentioned that before, is I go out and I visit all the buildings, and they all know me and I know what's going on, and I can see what's the first impression of the place. I do a first impression tour every year where I make sure I go to every single community and I do a half-day training with all their teams, and then we go through and we look at the building and say, okay, why is it important? But that gets me out there, and I know, hey, how do the carpets look? How's the paint look? What's the landscaping look like? And you just can't do that when you're running hundreds and thousands of communities.
Absolutely, good point.
So a topic of conversation that has come up over and over again in a lot of the conversations that we've had is this kind of power of regional operators, which it's not a new conversation. I just think coming out of this kind of COVID era seems to be a shift with a lot of these portfolios, whether it be private equity or REITs, to these more regional type players. Obviously, that's the position that you are in right now here in Houston. What do you feel like you are in a better position now talking to these different owners and landlords?
I certainly do. I mean, again, they're looking for expertise, in particular markets. So again, from your specific resident market, what are people looking for? What type of communities? Do you want urban? Do you need suburban? And we certainly have some of both. But we know what Spring, Texas is like. We know what downtown Houston is like. We know the difference between River Oaks and Tanglewood and West University. And I think sometimes, larger providers, they just can't know that, but there's no way for them to know that.
Sure.
They may have regional VPs and so forth that, are more knowledgeable, but, the home office, I think, just doesn't have that ability because they're not there. I mean, I drive these streets all the time, and, I shop in these areas, and so I know where things are, and I know what people are looking for. And, it was interesting. We actually had put in a call center at one time, because we thought it was a great idea. We'll have somebody nice to answer the phone all the time. Well, they were based out of Colorado. And I remember Jim Gray, our president, calls in one day, and I think he was testing to see if what he thought of this whole concept that we had put in place. And he asked for some directions, and although they had general guidelines at the call center, they really didn't know. And so he very specifically said, well, how do I get from Westheimer over to Shepherd? And somebody local would know that, and they couldn't answer it. They say, oh, well, let me pass it back to somebody
Sure.
at the local level. And but then by that time you're on hold, and then you get transferred to somebody else, and the conversation's just jointed. And so it really made it clear to us as the local knowledge makes a big difference. And so I think our investment partners are looking for the same thing. We've got very strong relationships with them, and and they're down here this week, visiting, and we're touring them around, and they know that we can get them to all the locations, and the locations know who we are, and so I think it makes for a better experience for them, and they kind of feel like, okay, you got a hold of the ball, and you understand what's happening. So I think that regional just allows you to do that, whereas when you're large, it's just logistically impossible.
Sure.
Well, I think one of the things, and it touches on all the points that you just mentioned, which I think are so valid, is the pandemic exposed some weak areas that had been brewing for years. And, I kind of break it down in my mind between, I think, probably a lot of the inventory, a lot of the community, a lot of the beds in our industry were really being more asset managed, meaning that you had large providers or large portfolio managers that quite frankly just were not set up to do a lot more than financial management, visiting the properties occasionally to give a quick, capital expenditure look through, to review financials, maybe to paper whip the executive directors a little bit, as I would refer to it. But there was not a lot of support. And to your point that you were also making, we are in the people business, whether it's recruiting and being empathetic to our team members, whether it's doing the same in attracting residents and that trust they give us, those families, to take care of those residents. That's at a very local level. And if you're not familiar with the dynamics, with the culture that exists in these communities, I'm with you. It's really amazing that in every market, no matter where you go in the country, every community has its uniqueness, its psychological barriers, and it's very interesting. I know in Knoxville it's the same way, north, south, east, and west. Even though you're in the same town, within a 30-minute drive radius, you can touch each one of those. The people on the west side of town, they shop differently, they live a little bit differently, they hang out with different people and different crowds. So a regional group that is focused, that can have the principals in the business involved in those communities, whether it be on their recruitment and retention or whether it be on the resident care side, I think we're seeing a move from asset management to quality of care, quality outcomes management in our industry. I actually think that's a good thing. So I'm excited about it. It's really awesome to see what you guys are doing. Thank you for your leadership in the space.
Yeah,
I know our audience is probably going to want to connect with you. We've had a couple of your team members on. Kimberly is a big friend of ours. We've had her on. And so kudos to everything you guys are doing.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Really glad to be here and
Yes.
chat with you guys this morning. So
Absolutely. Great time. Great conversation, Dave. We really appreciate your time. And so for our listeners, we'll put all of this information in our show notes. You can go to btgvoice.com. You can download the transcript. You can connect with us on social. Send us a message. And we'd love to see you there. Thanks for listening to another great episode of Bridge the Gap.
Thanks for listening to Bridge the Gap podcast with hosts Josh Crisp and Lucas McCurdy. If you were informed, educated, or influenced by this episode, we want to know. Leave a comment on social media or contact us in the show notes. Powered by supporting partners, Propel Insurance, Enquire, LTC REIT, The Bridge Group Construction, and Solinity. Learn more at btgvoice.com.